Okay, in this video, we are going to discuss defenses to criminal conduct. So the first defense, well, before we get into that, the burden of proof, I've said it before, is on the prosecution. So they have the burden to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant committed the crime in question. And to do that, they must prove the actus reus and the mens rea. So the actus reus is the guilty act, the actual criminal act that they perpetrated. And then the mens rea is that they had a guilty mind when they committed that crime. Sometimes clients will have a reason why they are legally not guilty of the crime, and they might be able to put that up as a defense. So these are known as affirmative defenses. And affirmative defenses are just where the defendant says, yes, I committed the act, but there is a reason for it. And we're going to go through these, but the different ones are automatism, intoxication, coercion or duress, necessity, alibi, entrapment, defense of property, ignorance or mistake, and self-defense. So looking at automatism, that's basically saying that I was unconscious or I had blacked out. It's been used before in sleepwalking cases. Then there's the insanity defense, and it's rarely used. It's used in less than 1% of felony cases, and it is raised by saying that the mens rea element is not there, that the person did not have a guilty mind because they didn't know what they were doing based on a mental illness. How they test for that is different in different jurisdictions. Then you have intoxication, and it's used to show that the defendant was not fully capable when the crime was committed, but it rarely works. It would be hard to raise a defense where you acknowledge that you deliberately got drunk and then committed a crime. But it can be used to show that certain parts of a crime aren't present. For example, if someone is being charged with first-degree murder. First-degree murder, one of the elements is that it is a premeditated type of crime. So they might say, okay, well, I didn't premeditate it because I was drunk when I did it. And it could possibly work, and they get convicted of second degree instead. So then there's coercion and duress. And that's where the person says, hey, I did it, but only because I was in fear for my life or from someone else. For example, if there's a manager of a bank and someone drives to his house and kidnaps him and takes him to the bank and makes him go into the vault and take all the money out and give it to the bank robber, the bank manager would not be guilty because he was acting under duress. Yes, he did the crime, but he didn't have the guilty mind. He was lacking the mens rea. This can also be used where gang members pressure other members to commit crimes. Then you have the defense of necessity, and it says I had no other choice but to commit the crime, meaning they had to do that in order to achieve a greater good. An example of that is someone who's speeding to get their pregnant wife to the hospital. One of the real cases that has actually been used in is where someone claimed they broke into a residence to protect themselves from the element. And that's always going to be up to the jury to decide if they think the person's telling the truth. Then there's the alibi. An alibi is basically a statement from a witness who says, there's no way so-and-so was there committing that crime because they were with me. Or it could be work records showing that a person was at work. It could be cell phone records where it shows that someone's cell phone was hitting a tower 500 miles away from the crime. Doesn't necessarily mean that person didn't commit the crime. It just means that their cell phone wasn't near the crime. The prosecution has to try to combat that by proving that the defendant was at the crime scene. Then there's entrapment, and sometimes students get confused. I think the general public gets confused on what entrapment actually is. So entrapment is when a defendant is induced or coerced to commit a crime that he or she might not otherwise have done had it not been for someone asking them to do it. So law enforcement can often use female officers to pose as prostitutes. Now, they can't go around soliciting people to have sex with them and then that person be found guilty unless that person approached them first. So, for example, law enforcement makes good use of confidential informants to do undercover drug buys. Well, if that person is doing it on their own accord and the police haven't forced them into doing it, it is not entrapment. I've also heard students in the classroom setting say, well, it's entrapment when a police officer hides his car up a dirt lane and catches me speeding. That's not entrapment. He didn't ask you to speed. He didn't trick you into speeding, or whoever it is that's speeding. He was just merely hiding, and it is okay for law enforcement to hide. That is not entrapment. Entrapment, again, is where you convince someone to do something that they otherwise wouldn't have done. So then there's the defense of property defense. North Carolina has what's called the Castle Doctrine, and it says that you can use deadly force to protect yourself and your home and car. However, it does not exempt you from civil liabilities. So if someone breaks into my house in the middle of the night, by law, I can shoot them. However, we have seen historically where families will come back of the victim, well, not the victim, I'm sorry, the defendant who broke into the person's house after they've died from a gunshot wound because they weren't prepared for the homeowner to shoot them. The family will come back and try to sue the actual burglary victim for pain and suffering and loss of life. Sometimes it works, sometimes it does not. Then there is ignorance or mistake. Ignorance and mistake basically say, I don't know. Well, ignorance says I didn't know it was illegal. Mistake says, well, I knew what I was doing, but I didn't know that it was illegal. They're rarely going to be accepted as defenses. And then lastly is self-defense. And in order for this one to be successful, a person has to be able to demonstrate that they thought that their life was in danger, that they were in immediate danger of being killed. It's often raised in homicide cases where one person kills another person. And again, it is up to the judge. It depends on what kind of trial you have. If you have a bench trial, it's up to the judge to decide if that's an acceptable defense. And if the person has a jury trial, it is up to the jury to decide. So now we have covered the possible defenses that people can use when they have been charged with a crime.